At this point, our sign up form can create a user, which is good, but our login page is just a blank page, just like you see it right here. So the first thing we need to do is to basically add this page to our URLs, or basically be able to add it to our navbar so that you can be able to navigate to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is to add some content inside the login page by extending our template. So just going to come and say extend space.html, and once I've done that, then we're also going to add the block contents. So I'll use block and then content, and then this is going to end block content. So just inside these tags is where I'm going to add the actual HTML content of this entire page. Now that we have that, then at this point we don't have any form that is rendered within our template. So if we need to add this form, then we need to pass our form instance or our form object within the template so that we render it. So the first test we're going to write is one that's going to allow us to basically do that. We're going to be able to check if we have a form instance that's rendered within our login template. So the instance is going to be an instance of the type authentication form. So the authentication form is a class that Django provides to help us log in our users. I'm going to begin by importing our authentication form. So I'll go at the top of our code and then say from Django.contrib.auth.forms. In this case, we're going to import our authentication form. And once you've imported our authentication form, we are going to go ahead and basically check if the form that will be rendered within our context will actually be an instance of our authentication form. I'm going to begin by writing a test. So I'm going to call this test a login page as, so in this case shall say as login form. And once I've done this, then in this case we shall say self, and then let's go ahead and try to create a request. So we're going to create a request that's similar to what we have here. So I'll just go right in here, and all I'll do is to paste in this code. So just tidy it up a little bit. And once you have this response, we can be able to access the context with which this was actually made. So to access our form, we can just create a variable called form, and then we'll be able to access the context. So we can do that by accessing response.context. So once we get that, then inside there, which is our context, so our context is in dictionary, just like many of you know. Inside this dictionary, we can use the .get method to help us access the key by which we save this form. So let's call it the form key. And once you have this, then you can be able to assert. So I'm just going to come and say self.assert, and in this case we shall assert if our form, the form which we have got from our context, is an instance of our authentication class. So that .assert instance basically takes in the the object which we expect to be an instance of a certain class. So the first argument is going to be the form, and in this case we're also going to provide the class for which we expect this to be an instance for. So once we've done that, then I'm going to save, and let's try to run our test right now. So when we run our tests, in this case we expect that this test is going to fail simply because we do not have any form instance that's being rendered within our response. So once what we're going to do is to head over to our views.py. Now I'm talking about the accounts views.py, and then we're going to create a form instance of our authentication form. So I'm just going to come right here and then copy this long import. So I'll go back to the top of our screen, and then I'll go ahead and import it. So within our login view, I'll just come and create a form instance. So this is going to be an instance of our authentication class, and then shall also create our context. So this context will be a simple dictionary that will have a key of form and the value of form. Now once we have this, let's go ahead and include this context in our render function. So at this point, we've been able to render our form with the template. So I'll go ahead and run our tests. And now we see that our test is running because we now have a form that's being rendered with this request. So now we've been able to render this form now, but we haven't yet actually put it within our login template. So to do that, we shall head over to our login.html, and then within our block tags in here is where we're going to put the content. So let's begin by, first of all, just adding a simple h1. And this h1 is going to just tell the user that this is where they log in from. And then we're going to create a form element. So this form element is going to be of method post. And then in here, we're going to begin by inserting a CSRF token, which is going to prevent users from submitting plain data that can be hijacked by hackers. So I'm going to begin by saying CSRF. So if you're wondering how I'm doing this, I'm using the Django extension, the Django VS Code extension. So once you have done that, then inside here, I'll basically say VAR, and this will generate these double curly braces. And inside here, since we have a form within our context, we shall just provide it in there. We shall also need a way to submit this form, so I'll just provide an input of type submit, and then the value is going to be, let's say, log in. So once we have that, then we expect to have our form being rendered on our template. So let's try to go back to our browser. When I refresh this time, we expect that our form is going to be rendered and our login heading is going to also be shown. But at this point, we don't have it in our header, so I'll head over to our base.html. So this is in our base.html, and within our header, I'll go ahead and just copy this. And then instead of having sign up, we're going to have login, and then we shall also change this to have our URL name, which is login page. So that's actually what we called it within our urls.py. We gave it a name of login page. And once you have that, when you go back this side, you now see that our link has been added to our login page. All right, so now we have our authentication form that's going to allow us to log in our users. But for the authentication form to work, we should have a user who is in our database. At this point, we've not been able to use any user to log in, but let's use our test to create a user. So I'm going to go back to our test.py. Within our test login, it's actually test login.py, and I'm going to begin by creating a setup function that's going to allow us to create a user at the start of running this test. I'm going to say def, setup. It's going to take in self. And within here, we're going to begin by providing some attributes. So let's say we're going to have self.username. And in this case, let's just call this user test user, and then 1, 2, 3. And then we're going to have their email being self.email, which is going to be equal to test user 1, 2, 3 at, let's say, gmail.com. And then what we're going to do here is going to be self.password. So we're providing the password attribute of the user, and that will also be, so we have to create a good password that will actually bypass general security. So in this case, we shall just say test password, and then we shall also provide some characters. So let's say ##, and then 1, 2, 3. So that's going to be our password. Now, using these attributes, you also need to create a user who is going to actually log in into our application. So once we have this, then let's go ahead and try to do that. So the way we're going to do that is by, first of all, accessing our user model. So I'm going to just import our get user model function that's going to allow us to return our user model. I'll just come and say from Django.contrib.auth, and then in here shall get our get user model function. And once you have that, then I'll just come here and say we're going to have our user being equal to get user model. And once you have that, then in here we shall just go ahead and try to create a user. So I'll just come and say, oh, let's actually just create a user, or actually let's just say user dot objects. So this will just go ahead and create a user. So we're going to call the create user method, and this will take in the attributes. So let's start with a username, and this username is going to be self dot username, and then we're going to also provide the email. Email will be self dot email, and then we're also going to provide the password. So the password is going to be self dot password, and then once we've done that, then this is actually going to have a user created at the start of this test. So now the first thing we need to do, since this is a form submission, we expect we're going to send post request. This post request will use the data that we get from the post request, and if the data belongs to a user, we shall log in the user, and if it does not, that means we shall not be able to log in the user. So the way we're going to do that is by writing a test right here, and this test is going to be, so we're going to just say def test, and then we're going to say test if the login page actually logs in a user. So this will take in self, the argument as the parameter, and now the first thing we need to do is to create a post request to this specific URL of our log. So we need to create a response, and this will be equal to self dot client dot post. So the post is different from the get. It takes in the URL as well as the data for that specific request. So in this case, we're going to use reverse, and then pass in the login page, and then we're also going to pass in the data. So the data is going to be the request data. So I'm just going to create that by coming and saying user data is going to be equal to, so shall have self dot username. Sorry for this. So this will be our username, which is going to be equal to self dot username, and then we shall also have our password, which is going to be equal to our self dot password. And once you have this, then that's what we're going to actually provide within our post request. So I'm just going to come here and say that we're going to use the user data. So if we made that post request and it's successful, we expect that this is going to actually redirect us to a page, to another page. So in this case, let's just say we're going to assert. So I'm just going to come and say self.assert. And in this case, we're going to assert if this page actually redirects to our home page. The first thing we need to provide is going to be our response, and then the expected URL. We shall provide the reverse to the URL of our home page. I don't know if I call it home page or home underscore page, but let me check. So when you go to our URLs in here, we actually have it called home page, which is good. So let me just close that for now. So let's try to implement this. So we're now testing if this is actually redirecting us to the home page. So I'm going to save, and this should only redirect us to the home page when the user is actually logged in. So when I save and run this test, of course, if it's going to fail because we don't have the post request for that specific view. So we have a failed test. Now we are now saying that our 200 status code is not equal to a 302 status code, and the reason this is happening is because we haven't yet made a post request, and the post request is not actually redirecting. So to make this work, let's go to our views.py. The first thing we shall do is to create a condition to check if we are actually making a post request. So I'm just going to come here and say if request dot method, and in this case we need to check if the method is post. So if the method is post for this specific request, then what we need is to actually submit the form with the request data that comes from the post request. Then that means we shall have to create another instance of our form, and this instance is going to have our authentication form. But this time we need to provide the request as well as the data that comes with that specific request. So in this case, I'll just come and say request.post. Now, if this form is valid, then we shall be having access to the various fields that this form is going to have. So in this case, what we can actually do is to just come and say if our authentication form is valid, so we shall just say a form dot is valid, and if it's valid, this will return true. Then we need to actually get the attributes of the user who belongs to this. Actually, the attributes of the user we have provided to this form. So in this case, we can access those by using, let's say, can get the username as being equal to form dot clean data dot. Since this is a dictionary, we can get the username. We can also get access to the password. So in this case, we can get access to the password by just coming here and saying that we're going to get that by providing form dot clean data dot get, and in this case we shall access the password. Now that we've done this, let's try to get the actual user. So Django provides us two very important functions that allow us to authenticate a user. So the first one is the authentication function, and what it does is to take in attributes that belong to a user. If the user exists, then it returns the user object. If the user doesn't exist, then it goes ahead and returns none. And the other one is the login function, which actually provides a session to the user who has logged in. So let's go ahead and try to import those. So I'll go at the top right here, and then I'll go and say from Django dot contrib. So it's going to be contrib dot auth. We are going to import, first of all, we shall import our authenticate function, and then we shall import our login function. So once we have that, then when I come down this side, we are going to first of all access our user object, and we shall access it by using our authenticate by passing in our attributes. So in this case, we're going to first of all pass in the request, and then we shall pass in the credentials of the user. So it's going to be a dictionary, and it will have our username. So this will have our username, and this username is going to be equal to our username, and then we're also going to have our password, and this is going to be equal to our password that we get from our authentication form. Now, if this user exists, then we can check that by saying if user is not none. In this case, we are going to log in the user, so we can do login, and then here we shall take in the request and then the user object. So in this case, we shall take in the user who want to log in. So when you log in this user, of course, we need to redirect to a success page. So I'll just come and say return. So we need to import the redirect shortcut, which is already imported here. So when I can just come and say return redirect, and when we redirect, we shall redirect to the home page. So I'll just say reverse and then home page, and once we've done that, then that will be it. So once we've been able to go ahead and provide this, so if the form is valid, we shall do all these things. We shall basically go ahead and log in the user, redirect them to the home page, and in case we do not have the request being post, of course, we're going to have our form being the authentication form, and in case all this fails, then we shall re-render our template with errors. So let's go ahead and try this. So when I save and try to run our test again, let's actually see what's going to happen. So it seems like we have an error. So you now see authenticate takes from 0 to 1 positional arguments that true were given. Let's see what we have here. So we actually provided authenticate, the request, and then the credentials. I think let's go ahead and pass in only the attributes. So I think that's the mistake I did. Sorry for that. So what you can do is to just pass in the attributes. So in this case, let's say we're going to have our username, and this is going to be equal to our username, and then we're going to have our password, which is going to be equal to our password. So hoping this is going to work. I'm going to save and then run our tests again. And now we see that our tests are actually working. So for now, this means that our test is being run and our tests are working finally, which means our form can now submit and actually log in a user. So to test that, we're going to go to our login page. Now I have a user called admin, and this is a password for the admin. So now I try to log in this user. Let's see what it's going to do. So it's actually going to redirect us to the home page. Now we can also go ahead and check things for the client session, and we can go and check in the client session and be able to check if this user is actually logged in, but I'm not going to do that for now. For now, we actually see that our user has been logged in. So to prove that, I'm going to go within our base.html, and what I'll do is to check. So we're going to implement this navbar or our header to be able to show us if a user is authenticated or not. So if a user is authenticated, we shall have access to some views, and in case they are not authenticated, of course we shall get access to views that are the login and the sign up. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to come and cut this out, and then what we shall do is to write a simple if. So I'll just come and say if, and then in this case we shall basically access the user. So in this case we can get something like request.user. You can say if user dot, so we can access the dot is authenticated. So this returns true, then we can be able to show the user. So I'll just come and say if user dot is authenticated, then we shall basically go ahead and provide this link for our home page. And let me actually just paste this here and then place our homepage URL in there. So this is actually going to be only shown in case they are logged in, and then we shall have an else. So in case they are not logged in, then we want to display everything, including the login and the sign up pages. So just going to do that and basically format this so that looks tidy. Let me actually just change that to this. So let's try to refresh. In this case, since our user has been logged in, we now see that this is going to be our home page being shown here. So another thing we can do is to maybe implement our login, and that's what we are going to do next. Actually, our logout page. So we're going to implement a logout page that's going to allow us to log in back into the application.